This is principle 6 of 11 against the Chinese Marxist model. And the sixth principle is that a communist dictatorship only lasts 3 generations. The Soviet Union, which had begun in 1917, collapsed in 1991 when Mikhail Gorbachev was General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin started the Marxist counter-revolution against human freedom in 1917 to subjugate Russians and later non-Russians to the dictatorship of the proletariat controlled by soft hands Marxist intellectuals who had never worked with their hands a day in their lives. Marxism was Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' answer to a puzzle in Europe. How could a person of non-noble birth get enough power to be able to oppress, starve, and kill their own fellow citizens? To that point in Europe, you had to be of noble birth to exercise the power of life and death over fellow citizens. The French Revolution on the continent had been an absolute disaster. They invented the guillotine to execute their political opponents. Consider Catherine the Great of Russia, the Tsarina of Russia from 1762 to 1796. She ruled for over 30 years and expanded Russian power and influence. She had been born into a modest German noble family. She married into the Russian nobility, she learned Russian, she converted to the Russian Orthodox Church, she became the ultimate ruler of Russia after having her husband Peter III arrested and forced to abdicate. Marx and Engels ignored the American Revolution on purpose and its egalitarian nature. New England in 1776 had 87% literacy rate for adult males. What kind of society in 1776 could have had such a high level of literacy, where the Europeans are bumping around at 7%, 9%, 12%? So in order to rule, you had to be from a noble family. Lenin and the Bolsheviks followed Marx's lead and won the Russian Civil War and set up the mass dictatorship of the proletariat, also known as the rule of man and the rule of the mob. There were no rights for dissenters or the minority. Lenin invented concentration camps, which was later emulated by Adolf Hitler for mass extermination of peoples. In Lenin's Bolshevik Russia, all other political parties and independent trade unions were banished. Their leaders were arrested, often shot or imprisoned. This was a new society based on the science of Marxism. Lenin died in January 1924. Stalin, the biggest butcher of his own people, with his 5-year economic plans based on the slave labor of the Gulag, he died in March 1953. Nikita Khrushchev, born in 1894, was alive when the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917. He was 23 years old at the time. He became first secretary of the Communist Party 1953 to 1964. Leonid Brezhnev, born in 1906. He was 10 when the revolution happened. Followed by Yuri Andropov as the supreme leader of the Soviet Union from 1982 to 1984. He had been born in 1914. He died in 1984. Konstantin Chernenko was born in 1911. He ruled from 1984 to 1985. Finally, with Mikhail Gorbachev, you had the third generation. He had been born in 1931 after the Russian Revolution. And the first generation of communist leaders like Lenin and Stalin had the desire and appetite to kill their own citizens to assure their power as supreme leaders. The second generation of leaders, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, they were all alive in 1917 during the time of the counter-revolution. They remembered the old system, also had the appetite to arrest, torture, and kill their own citizens to stay in power, but not at the mass level of the first generation of a Lenin, a Stalin, a Trotsky. But they did continue the Gulag archipelago and 5-year plans and the slave labor that was endemic in the Gulag. Gorbachev, again, was born in 1931. He did not remember the ancien regime, the old regime. He only knew the dictators, the self-dealing and corruption of the Communist Party into which he had been born. He tried to remake it through something called glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He was forward-thinking arms control and worked with Reagan to reduce, as opposed to just limit, the growth of nuclear weapons. In 1989 through 1991, when Eastern Europe ran for the exits from 45 years of Soviet army occupation after World War II, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated in 1991 as non-Soviet states in the USSR went for the exits. Gorbachev did not have the same appetite to arrest, torture, and kill his own citizens. And remember, a dictatorship can only survive if it is willing to arrest, torture, and kill its own citizens. If the citizens do not fear the dictatorship, then the dictatorship will fall. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China won the Chinese Civil War in 1949. There's never been a free election held after they seized power. 44 million Chinese citizens were executed or starved to death under the Communist Party of China and its progressive government, based on the science of Marxism. Mao died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping was the next significant ruler from 1978 to 1989. He had been born in 1904. Jiang Zemin was the leader from 1989 to 2002. He had been born in 1926 before the 1949 counter-revolution. Hu Jintao ruled from 2002 to 2012. He had been born in 1942. And finally, we have Xi Jinping, who is now the supreme leader of China. He was born in 1953. Now, if we go to the second generation of leader, we'll say Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping oversaw prodigious growth of 10% or better per year. But he did crush the democracy movement across China in 1989, to include the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing, June 4, 1989. And that included soldiers firing their rifles into apartments of Chinese citizens. That included running Chinese citizens over with tanks, which naturally kills them. Before sunrise, they'd already taken down the goddess of democracy, a papier-mâché statue with a steel structure in Tiananmen Square, which faced a portrait of Mao Zedong in the highest place of honor on the Forbidden City of China. It's important to take down this threatening statue, immobile statue. She was staring at the ultimate dictator, Mao, on the Forbidden City, and she was holding a torch of freedom, just as is held by our Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The CPC is so weak that they have to ban an image of the goddess of democracy. Now you can see on the back of my book, China, Demise of a Civilization. Xi Jinping is the third generation of leaders. He was born after the 1949 counter-revolution. Xi Jinping was alarmed at the 1991 demise of the Soviet dictatorship, and he is committed to preventing the same, in his eye, error to happen in China. After all, he, as the supreme leader, rules over 1.4 billion citizens and is able to determine who lives, who dies. He can enrich his family, his friends, and himself in the property of the Chinese people, and nobody may ask how much he has or how he got it. The issue is, how willing is he and the CP willing to kill their own citizens to stay in power? Do they have the same appetite as Mao and his fellow soft hands Marxist intellectuals? 44 million starved and executed citizens is quite something. They had struggle sessions where a citizen would be made to stand. It could be in Village Square, it could be in a classroom, it could be on a stage, it could be in a stadium, and castigated for their failings to be one of the bad four types. And sometimes they were beaten to death on stage using farm implements. And the target there is not to silence this single individual, but the entire audience and those who hear about it and are aware of what can happen to you if you do not follow the rule of the CPC. Do not step out of line. The CPC rules, and the CPC attends to politics. Today, China spends more on controlling and surveilling its own people than they do on national defense. They use facial ID. They have cameras in so-called smart cities. They have monitors in your apartment to see your comings and goings. They censor the internet and the news. People have social scores, which determine their ability to get jobs or certain apartments or homes. In the early 2020s, they had interned over 1 million men, Muslim men, in Western China to educate them and denigrate the Muslim faith. Control the people is the penultimate goal of the CPC. Do not be fooled by a feigned concern about economic growth. Large state-owned entities will be favored by its socialist economies. They cannot trust privately held companies with initiative that think outside of the party. Going into a recession is fine, so long as the CPC's grip on power remains. Look at the abject poverty of communist Cuba and socialist Venezuela. In our own backyard, they've both been driven into abject poverty by progressive parties. But those progressive parties will not loosen their grip on their own people, and they are willing to kill their own citizens to keep their progressive parties in power. Consider that before Xi Jinping, membership in the Communist Party, after many decades, it was apparent that that could lead to better jobs, better economics for yourself and your family. So many members of the parties were there for the benefits and not because they particularly enjoyed suppressing their brothers and sister citizens. One of the first things that Xi Jinping did on coming to power in 2012 was to run a quote-unquote anti-corruption campaign within the CPC. Now that was nothing more than getting opportunists out of the CPC, so you had more reliable left CPC party members who were a motivated cadre to keep the CPC in control. Xi had so-called, Xi thought, elevating the Chinese constitution to the level of Mao thought, which is basically nothing more than a vanity project for the leader, but it also shows his power over the party. It doesn't put any more food on a citizen's plate. And to use the word constitution is in fact a fiction. Constitutions in these Marxist countries are mere jewelry that they borrow from democracies to give a patina of legitimacy, but it means nothing. Their constitutions say there's freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion, but that does not exist when push comes to shove. In 2018, rules were changed so that a leader was no longer limited to 2 5-year terms, and in 2023, Xi Jinping was granted a 3rd term. So this is now the 3rd generation. Does Xi and the CPC have the same appetite to arrest, torture, and kill their own Chinese brothers and sisters to stay in power? My 6th principle against the Chinese Marxist model says they do not. And that is why CPC cannot continue its dictatorship over the Chinese citizens past the 3rd generation. Their only hope is to be bailed out by elites of Western nations who put the interests of the CPC above the interests of liberal democracies in the West. You can read about the 6th principle in my book, China, Demise of a Civilization, the 11 Principles of History and Economics Against the Chinese Marxist Model. Thank you.